Next year, 2014, will mark 2 decades since our country's transition to democracy. We are going to be inundated by 20-year celebrations. I mean, the WWF likes to be ahead of the curve, so I thought we could start doing that right now. So it seems to me this is a good time to take stock of both the achievements of our country and also our continuing challenges. The National Development Plan, of course, has attempted to do this, but more recently a research report commissioned by the US investment banker Goldman Sachs did this as well, called 2 Decades of Freedom. I shall use both of the reports to, on the one hand, take stock of where we are, and then to try to focus on just 2 key challenges that I think the country is facing. So let's just think about the report card from the last 20 years. As always, in the case of an honest self-assessment, and some things have got better and other things have got worse. I mean, we really, as a country, need to escape from the oversimplistic things that everything's gone to hell or everything's fine. I mean, that wouldn't be true of a personal life. It wouldn't be true of our kids' report cards, or if it was true, you should worry about the school that they were at. It's always possible to get better, and there's always something good that has been going on. And so let's just take stock. If we look at macroeconomic report card, I mean, here the report card is overwhelmingly gold stars. It's overwhelmingly very good passes. It's important immediately to remind those people in the room who are old enough to remember this, that prior to 1994, our country was locked into a decade and a half of double-digit inflation. In fact, with inflation bumping up at the 20% level. And by the way, once you get into the 20% level, you really are in an inflation trap. You destroy the sense of value of investors, of customers, of workers, of managers. And you get into a kind of silly money and a silly time period. Over the prior 20 years, the average was 14% inflation. And in the last 20 years, we've managed inflation down to just around the 6% upper limit of our inflation targeting. And this really is a very substantial achievement, not just an economic achievement, by the way. If you look at the history of post-colonial Latin America, you will see a very strong coincidence with high inflation, with instability, and with military rule. And thank goodness that's not what we are immediately facing. On government indebtedness, and I'm going to go a little bit beyond the report, I mean, people forget that South Africa actually reneged on their foreign obligations in the mid-1980s and had to hire a Swiss banker to talk nicely to our foreign creditors and to reorganize our foreign credit. I mean, we ran out of money to pay our foreign creditors. So we went bust as a country in the mid-80s. You might also remember that a previous finance minister went personally insolvent. So it's just quite important when you think about where we are to remember where we have come from. And so in 1994, the Goldman Sachs report indicates that government debt as a percentage of GDP was about 50%, was just under 50%. This came down to 28% in 2008, but has gone back up to 42%. So we are a little bit better. I would remind people of 2 big events in this 20 years. 1998, which was basically an emerging market bust, Russia defaulting on its foreign credit, Brazil and Argentina breaking parity with the dollar, which was a clever way of defaulting on your foreign credit, of course, because you suddenly paid people half of what they were expecting. So the country's foreign reserves have risen from a low of $3 billion US, and to that you should add, you know, that our Reserve Bank basically ran a betting book on future contracts in foreign currency, or a so-called open foreign currency book, and they were about 10 billion in the red at this time. Actually, maybe it was closer to 20 billion. I don't have the number exactly in my head, but we were substantially indebted in terms of real measurements of South African funds and foreign liabilities. And now our foreign currency reserves stand at about 48 billion. Still, in my view, not not nearly enough, but a very lot better than 3 billion minus 10. Foreign direct investment, and again, just to remind people, because we don't always explain the terms that we use, a lot of the money that flows into the country flows into share purchases and the purchase of bonds, fixed income instruments. But that we would call portfolio investment. It's money that comes easily in, can go as easily out. I mean, it moves on nanoseconds. Foreign direct investment, we're talking about money that comes in to build factories. It's a bricks and mortar investment. It's an investment in fixed investment in the actual productive capacity of the economy. That over the last 20 years has averaged $2 billion a year. Again, not nearly enough. It has been very volatile, and it's moved with the big investments that you can remember. The moving in of Barclays into the bank, the Chinese bank that bought 20% of Standard, movements into SAA and Telkom and out over that period. It's interesting, the Goldman Sachs report targets a level of 10 billion US FDI a year as the level we should aspire to. And that seems to be, possible actually if you take our best years and make them our average years. And I guess in many ways that's what we should be doing. Now, a further macroeconomic change is evident in our country's trade performance. Just remember, South Africa is a small, very open economy. I mean, when we say very open, about 70% of our gross domestic product crosses our borders. So we are a Sweden, a Switzerland, a Holland. We're a small, open economy. And so our trading partners and our terms of trade are very important. And 20 years ago, the European Union was our absolutely dominant trading partner. 20 years later, Asia and Africa have grown dramatically to the point that China is the single largest individual country with whom we trade. But it's a much more balanced pattern of trade that we have now. And if a spaza shop should have more than one customer, so a country needs to have more than one trading partner or continent. Now, the social report card is more mixed. Per capita GDP has increased by some 40%. And that's actually quite a significant achievement. And access to services such as electricity, water, and sanitation in the report are recorded from moving from, generally speaking, under 50% to around 80%, a very significant improvement over that time. So too has the expansion of our social welfare net. Over this 20-year period, at the beginning of the period, we had about 2 million South Africans receiving a social grant. I do want to pause for a moment on this issue of social grant, because I think we have a confused national dialogue about this. The 2 million were overwhelmingly people drawing state pensions. Now, since the Union of South Africa began, South Africa has run a state pension system. And I've never actually heard a white South African talking about a terrible thing to earn a state pension when you turn 65. That 2 million people has gone to 16 million people. Now, there are a number of grants. The two largest are pensions and child grants. There are disability grants and other forms of grant. By value, I understand 70% of the social grant budget remains in pensions. So it's still by value, it's overwhelmingly a pension system. But there are 16 million people receiving some kind of social net from the country. Now, that's a very considerable achievement. I think in terms of the size of our economy and society, and this 16 million people, it's actually a larger system than the Bolsa Familia in Brazil. And we admire the Brazilian system very much. And for any of us who drive around rural South Africa, you know what the social pension system has done to rural commerce and rural well-being. So for me, this is an overwhelmingly positive. And yes, of course, it's not a substitute for people being economically active. But goodness, it has made a change to the life of the elderly, particularly in our society, and particularly the elderly who were not white. Now, and literacy levels, as recorded by the Goldman Sachs report, have also improved significantly over the 20-year period. Now we move to some negatives, because there are always negatives. overwhelmingly, the first and major negative is, as the National Development Plan put it, too few people economically active. National Development Plan figure is 41 out of 100 in some form of economic activity. That definition, by the way, starts at the age of 15 and continues to 65. So that 41 out of 100 is of that age group. It's a slightly odd, because at 15 you would actually expect a lot of people to be at school, but there you are. Unemployment, which you will know in South Africa we use both a narrow and a broad, but meaningfully the number of people out of work has moved from 4.7 million to 5.6 million, a significant increase if you think of the million people that we are talking about. In terms of the broad measure of unemployment, which includes discouraged work seekers, 37% of the adult population is unemployed, 26% when you use the narrow definition. Now, obviously, this is a huge social, economic, and political problem. And of course, it leads very directly to levels of poverty by any set of measures being very stubbornly high. I mean, the level of people in poverty using the Treasury poverty datum line has basically remained the same in percentage terms and grown in absolute numbers. Well, there you are. That's a snapshot of our economy and society as we set off in pursuit of the inclusive and resilient economy that the World Wildlife Federation is seeking for our third decade of freedom. I said I would just identify a couple of challenges just to provoke your thoughts. The first challenge is an external challenge, and I'm rather deliberately doing this. I mean, environmentalists of all people should understand you can't conceive of your reality entirely defined by national borders. Climate change doesn't stop at Beit Bridge or indeed at OR Tambo. We live in a global system. South Africans are very, very, very self-centered. And we think about South Africa as the center of the world, and we don't pay much attention to what's happening in our neighborhood or indeed in our globe. And we do this to our peril because we live in an increasingly integrated world. And so the first challenge that I want to identify is an external challenge. It's really a broad-based comment on the state of the global economy. And here it goes. I want to remind you that as we move into 2014, the world is moving into the 5th year of the greatest economic slowdown, certainly since 1929. And indeed, there are academics who suggest that the financial collapse of 2008 was more dramatic and longer enduring than the 1929 depression. So there are economies that are beginning to show some signs of growth. The United States, for example, even as I was watching television last night, Britain. Japan is coming out of a 20-year period of economic contraction. But please be aware that this level of growth, particularly in the United States, is based on a level of fiscal stimulus which is absolutely unprecedented in the history of mankind, and I'm convinced is absolutely unsustainable. And this is not a very complicated thing. You know, if you put the price of money at 0.25%, and you therefore make the price of debt very cheap, below inflation, and therefore negative in real terms, you're building a future on sand, on very, very shaky foundations. At some stage, people who save are going to have to be rewarded. At some stage, the Federal Reserve and other central banks are going to have to go back to positive interest rates. So just imagine the US economy at a 5% interest rate rather than a 0.25% interest rate. And think about Europe and think about other parts of the world. And we see as the rumors of the tapering of quantitative easing, and what amazing gobbledygook phrases politicians are able to cook up for printing money. It's astonishing. When you think about this, I think there are further adjustments that we're going to have to live with. And I would argue that we really have to face up to a long period, a decade easily, maybe two, remember Japan, of lower global growth. So if the global economy grew over the last 20 years at somewhere around 3%, take 1% off and think about what the world's going to look like. And prudent people would do that, actually. Now, what is the implication for South Africa if you think about the world economy in that way? Well, I think it's mainly this, because we are so open. And the openness is not just what we import, but it's the pricing impact. Essentially every market is a global market. Just walk into Mr. Price and have a look around and see what goods they are selling and why they are selling them. And ask the average South African consumer how far the Buy South African slogan takes them. So we're a very open economy. If we are ourselves to escape from very low levels of growth, and I think there's a band going forward, growth at sort of 2 to 2.5% gives you one kind of prospect of a future. Not very good news about unemployment, not very good news about poverty, not very good news about inequality. Growth at 2 or 3% above our population growth rate, which, as with the world, is very promising. So 4 to 5%, a completely different story over the next 20 years. If we want to be in the 4 to 5% range, South Africans have to become more competitive. We just have to get better at attracting investors, customers, making goods and services. Now more than ever, we face a challenge of productivity and innovation and getting smarter at the way that we use resources. I want to give you just one example of this, and that is, in the 1960s, when the rest of the world had a green revolution, and if we think back to the Limits of Growth report, where it was indeed believed that we couldn't feed, the 3 billion people that existed at this time, what proved those scientists wrong was a complete revolution in food production. New crops, new agricultural techniques, and to some extent new patterns of distribution. Well, the most exciting work that the National Planning Commission did was precisely in agriculture. And they came to the view that we could use water and land much more sensibly with regard to food production. And if you combine this with some very exciting developments around crop development, and by the way, in this audience, I have to say, not genetic modification, but naturally drought-resistant crops that we have the capacity to identify and introduce in our country and in our continent, that then we could be part of an African green revolution, an African food revolution. On the water side, the estimate of our research was that we could use existing irrigation schemes. We could use 30% less water in those schemes or increase their efficiency by that. And then also, if we designed a flexible and fit-for-purpose form of land ownership and land utilization for food production, we have the capacity to significantly increase food production. The third element of this is joining a global trend where it's not anymore government quotas or government subsidies that really determine food production, but supermarket purchasing that does. We live in a supermarket-dominated food production world, and if we're able to get smart about food distribution and agro-processing and food logistics, we have the capacity to become much more competitive in food production, and that's just one area. Okay, the second challenge is an internal challenge. It's the challenge around inclusive growth. And I know we've used this phrase in different terms, I think rather unsuccessfully for the last 20 years. I think here our country needs a much deeper discussion, not so much about inclusive growth, but indeed about the term wealth creation. The concept should denote the way South Africans sustainably take 100 units of resources, land, labor, capital, and technology, and create 110 units of value. I mean, that's growing value in the real economy and in the real society. People are and should be at the absolute center of this process. Sadly, post-1994, as we integrated with the world community and as the African National Congress and our government joined that group of people who very unwisely go to Davos every end of January. So we incorporated what I can only describe as a kind of Ayn Rand capitalism. A capitalism that was fund manager driven. Pensions were individualized. Pensions went from being long-term investments with a low risk profile and low return expectations to being a 3-month return on capital gains from fund managers who were managing 30 to 60 shares every quarter and had to show returns, and whose bonuses and cash payments were determined by this. Now, I don't think there was maligness in any of this, but it has fundamentally changed the world of investment. It's redefined the concept of profit, and it's redefined the concepts of reward and risk. And I think it has been part and parcel of creating a world that Minister Gordon described very well last week as being a world that's all about me and not at all about we. So it's a world that's also turned to instant consumption and instant gratification and ostentatious lifestyles and Lamborghinis. Not that I'm particularly against Lamborghinis. Yeah, now this global trend, please observe, has seen a secular reduction in employment, in relative earnings, and in social cohesion. And this is a trend that honestly is as evident in New York as it is in Madrid, as it is in Lisbon, as it is in New Delhi, as it is in Beijing, and as it is in Sandton. Please notice I chose Sandton deliberately. And, we as a society need to stop and say, is this the kind of economy and society we want? In contrast, I actually believe that for a company to employ people is a very honorable thing. I think, a company annual report that said last year our workforce was 2,000, this year it's 2,200. I think they should be praised to the rooftops, also by the World Wildlife Federation, because people matter. So I think that, it would be nice if the Sunday Times top 100 companies weighted employment creation as a factor in measuring company success. I think they need to think about their criteria. I'm saying this because, if we're going to survive as a democracy and a non-racial society, we've got to go back and think about these values. We need to view employing people not only as an economic necessity, but also as a social and political achievement. We need to see raising the level of skill and competence of employed people as absolutely critical to raising the competitiveness of South African businesses in a world of lower growth. So these are the two challenges. Okay, very briefly, the World Wildlife Foundation, and just this. I learned some time ago from one of my bosses that it's very important in life to A, do the right thing, and B, do it in the right way. And so this is a prophetic organization. It speaks the truth to power, as Edward Said said. I'm very keen that you should be constructively and patriotically prophetic, in the sense that you should help to make the future possible. And this is exactly, Chair, what you were doing in your introductory remarks. The environmental challenges that we face in South Africa and in the world are huge, but they're completely capable of human beings meeting that challenge and succeeding. We can get our country right, and we can deal with climate change if the people in this room carry on doing what they're doing. Thank you very much.